Welcome, audience, to Werewolf episode number 7. It's our honor and pleasure today to speak to Ren, who has already made an appearance on Arctos Media, but who has been good enough to join us today to talk about his book, to talk about various ideas central to his publicity till now. As he has already been introduced by my colleague, Constantine van Hofmeister, some weeks ago, I will ask people who are interested in his background to listen to that podcast. Here we'll just dive into the deep. Ren, welcome and thank you for joining.
It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking to the good people at Arctos again.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. An interesting thing that should be said is that some things of what you are being saying in your work, in your publicity, for a long time already now, fit very well into, let's say, the traditionalist school that has been represented in much of the publicities in Arctos. That sounds contradictory because, in fact, much of your work has focused on lifestyle choices, on physical health, on choices that people make in their physical condition, and also about the evolutionary aspect thereof. You have talked about that. Well, traditionalism, of course, comes from a very different perspective, a very spiritual perspective, we can say, and a much more theory-driven perspective as well. So what I found very interesting in the meeting of these ideas on the same topic, namely the degeneration of our culture, the decline of the West, the fall of the West in a certain sense, they have a meeting point. And I would say that one of the meeting points that I detect in your work is what I would call the mano-sphere. So some of your work has been focused on men's health, in relation to that, men's rights. And you have been talking a lot about the crisis of masculinity. Of course, these are topics that actually shaped the alt-right. So what is now known as the dissident right, the movement to which you and me both belong, or are said to belong, for the good or for the bad. This movement, of course, was inspired by the alt-right. So figures like Stefan Molyneux and Jordan Peterson, who do not want to be associated with this alt-right, but who were, by outsiders, they have been talking a lot about mano-sphere topics, about men's rights, and about the crisis of masculinity. It seems to be that this discourse, the mano-sphere discourse, has gone somewhere to the background in the last couple of years under perhaps influence of topics such as geopolitical developments and so on. But I believe they are as relevant as they ever are. And I see discontinuity in your work, which I find very important. Can you say something about your perception of how people have been approaching men's rights, the mano-sphere, and the topic of the crisis of masculinity? Do you see any progress? Do you see a rising awareness? How do you see perception of this discourse?
Yeah, I think there's definitely there have definitely been developments, certainly in the last less than 10 years even. I mean, I think that things have changed. I think for all, for all that you may or may not sort of like Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson in particular, I think has been instrumental in bringing this kind of stuff into the mainstream. And you said that he doesn't really particularly want to be associated with the alt-right, the dreaded alt-right, or he sees himself as a classical liberal. But he has certainly done a lot to popularize men's issues about masculinity, about the role of men within society, about the need for men to take control of their lives, about the need for strong men in any kind of society, that kind of stuff. I mean, so I think that Jordan Peterson has been very, very, as the sort of superstar intellectual that he is, I think that he's been instrumental in bringing all of this stuff to the mainstream. And the reception, well, I mean, there's been an almost religious kind of, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon has almost been like a kind of religious awakening, I think, and you only need to watch his I mean, he gets very emotional. Obviously, we know that he often ends up in tears. But his audience is the same, and you see this if you've seen, sort of YouTube footage of his sort of stadium tours and conference tours and speaking tours and that kind of stuff. That men really do. They do have a kind of religious experience in his presence, and you have people rushing the stage asking Jordan Peterson to pray for them, and massive lines of young men wanting to meet him after the speech, and have their book signed and tell him about how he's changed their life. So I don't think, regardless of whether or not you agree with everything Jordan Peterson says, I think it's hard not to see actually the emergence of Jordan Peterson and his rise to superstardom as a very positive development. But there's also, of course, then he has his detractors and there's been a kind of anti-Jordan Peterson backlash, of course, among feminists and left-wingers and the usual kind of suspects. But I think he's been called every name under the sun. Of course, he's been called a Nazi and which is just absolutely ludicrous. But so I think that the kind of manosphere, what we would broadly consider to be the manosphere discourse, has definitely become mainstream now. But then you've also got people like Andrew Tate, of course, who are kind of I mean, he represents a different kind of side of the manosphere, I think, and he is. I mean, he's not particularly someone I'm fond of, but and really what he's doing actually, I think, is just rehashing old manosphere talking points about hypergamy and all that kind of stuff. Women dating, sort of punching up when they date, and men kind of punching across and down, and the kind of the craziness of the dating market and all that kind of stuff. So I mean, he's obviously some with somebody like Andrew Tate and figures like Andrew Tate, then they're not really advancing the discourse in any sense. They're only advancing it to the extent that they're very, very popular. And Andrew Tate is very, very popular and has been very popular on social media. But I mean, as far as developments within the manosphere, then I mean, I think, yes, you've got people who are just repeating the same talking points, and then you've got people who are taking it to a broader audience. I mean, I think fundamentally the underlying issues remain. I don't think that there's been any, apart from let's say like the growth of the sort of self-help and the kind of self-help movement, the male self-help movement, people sort of self-development movement, you could call it, then, and that has become quite a widespread thing, and that's a good thing. But fundamentally, I think that the issues that underlie the manosphere, the emergence of the sort of manosphere as a sort of distinct thing, I don't think that they've changed at all. And in many respects, I think probably the dating market is worse than it was when the manosphere first emerged. I think that men are still, despite all of the the focus on somebody like Jordan Peterson and his largely sort of positive reception, and the fact that he does get a lot of airtime, and he goes on television shows around the world, etc. I still think that fundamentally, I'm not entirely sure that men's issues are taken seriously, really, any more than they were before. So I don't. There are some signs, I think, of progress, definitely, but I think that fundamentally the agenda and the issues remain the same as they were 10, 15 years ago.
Yes, well, what you said, the mixed picture, so the lack of progress in certain sense. You talk a lot about Jordan Peterson here, of course, because he is one of the exponents of this manosphere movement. But always when I listen to him, I listened to him live, in fact, 2 times, and it strikes me as this very over-emotional load that's being put on the audience, what people also expect. They expect that. They expect a kind of a Dr. Phil moment in a certain sense.
Yeah.
And I find it, that sounds maybe strange, but a rather feminine approach to solving problems.
Yeah.
I do understand there is a therapeutic value, but I think that should be kept between the patient and the doctor and not being played out in a large audience. I also think the kind of presentation he gives, it projects weakness, right? It projects, it always emphasizes problems, it emphasizes issues. It's speaking like to an audience that has problems by a man who has experienced these problems. What I find in your work much better is practical advice about how to live more healthy, how to build your life, and to be realistic in assessments of the outside world and how it impacts health. I think this is a very positive approach instead of this emotional approach. On the other hand, I do notice also some, let's say, awareness growing in the public sphere of the problem. Let's say, looking at certain products of the entertainment industry. So a certain realization of how bad things have become is starting to filter in to the mainstream discourse. Look at a movie like Idiocracy. I mean, that's well known to all of us, but also something like Made for Children, Wall-E, right? Talking about the end of man, what you would call the end of man, right?
Yeah.
Let's say a proof of my thesis of devolution theory, right? The implosion of what it means to be not only a man, but to be a human. In your talks, you have said the slogans such as "be yourself" and "you are perfect as you are," they are very, very counterproductive. They, in fact, they are signs of degeneracy, and they reinforce the process, the degenerative process. So I would like to add also from my side to this that I believe devolution is not just a question of physical health and the deterioration of genetic dispositions, which have received wide attention, for example, in the work of Edward Dutton, which I find very useful. But also there is a social, let's say a social economic aspect to it. So dissident right is known for its quite libertarian, American dissident right is known for its libertarian approach to societal problems. So it emphasizes meritocracy. But I have doubts in this. I believe that people that have money now, that are powerful now, that have status now, are in fact, it can be argued, people that are least suitable or should be the least suitable to have offspring and to have a future. I mean, look at the boomers. Look at their ideal, right? The Wolf of Wall Street kind of idea. So I would say at the moment, to have success and to have status in the West, especially for men, it's actually an indicator, quite sure indicator of either mental disease or ethical bankruptcy or both. So I think meritocracy, it went out of the window a long time ago. Of course, I come from a continental European background that is always a little bit critical of, let's say, individualistic meritocracy. Another aspect of that is that the people that make it to the West, that immigrate to the West from the non-West, they are also selected in a quite negative way. They are selected on, let's say, sob stories, on fake reasons, legalistic procedures. So we're having an overall process here, if you would describe it in evolutionary theory, I would say of devolution, actual real devolutionary process enhanced by, let's say, the political class that is profiting from this. What's your take of that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that that there is a process of devolution taking place, and I mean that in the sense of simply that we are moving further and further away from exercising our powers, physical, mental, spiritual, etc., to their fullest extent. I mean, you talked about Wall-E, and Wall-E is a great one for this. This sort of vision of the future where we're all massively obese and we're strapped into sort of you know kind of like robotic chairs that drive us around, and we have a screen in front of us, and we're basically immobilized. We're just like a brain in a vat, basically, and barely even that. And I do think that there is a process of physical and mental and spiritual degeneration taking place, and it's all tied up together. I mean, one of my favorite books, a book that I can't really talk enough about, is Nutrition and Physical Degeneration by Weston A. Price. And that was a book that was written in the 1930s, published in 1939, if memory serves correctly. Weston A. Price was a Canadian dentist who practiced in the US, in Cleveland, and he basically observed over a period of many years. So he became a dentist at the sort of end of the 19th century, and he was very well placed to observe the effects of the adoption of a sort of modern industrial diet that was built on novel foodstuffs produced in factories. So at the time he became a dentist, then people were still largely consuming locally produced whole foods, animal foods, vegetables, grains, etc., but locally produced, more or less in a kind of unrefined state, minimally processed, a kind of what you might call a time-honored diet, basically. But what happened over the course of 20, 30 years, 40 years, even while he was a practicing dentist, was that people came to rely more and more on foods that were highly refined and produced in factories and sold in cans and in packaging in shops, rather than being produced locally and minimally processed. And Weston Price observed that his patients, his dental patients, and especially the children, were suffering terrible, terrible physical degeneration in front of his eyes. It was literally happening in front of him. He could see this kind of process taking place where they weren't developing properly physically. It was especially pronounced in the face. People's faces were literally collapsing. Their jaws and teeth weren't developing properly. Their cheeks were hollow. Their nostrils were narrowing. And this led to, I mean, as well as marring people's physical appearance, it led to all sorts of other unpleasant physical side effects like weakened immunity, but also mental problems as well. So he noticed that a lot of children were developing behavioral issues, developmental issues, comprehension issues that weren't obvious in the population before they had started eating this industrial diet. And so his hypothesis was, well, these people are physically degenerating because of what they're eating. But what he did, he didn't leave that hypothesis there. He actually wanted to test it. So what he did was he went around the world and he visited a wide variety of traditional societies: Africa, North America, Oceania, the Pacific, but also Europe. So he went to the high alpine Lotenschal. I don't know if I've said that properly. Lotenschal Valley in Switzerland, and he went to the Outer Hebrides, and he found groups who were consuming their traditional diets and living in a traditional manner, and looked at their health as a comparison case for to compare against what was happening in the US. And what he also did as well was he went to these places and he observed native groups, traditional groups, who were also transitioning to a Western style diet built on industrial foodstuffs. And he observed among the natives who stuck to their traditional diets that they had amazing health. So, when he went to the Outer Hebrides and he studied these Scottish crofters and fishermen who were still eating traditional diet of lots of fish, lamb, oats grown in the traditional manner, organ meat, etc., crustaceans, milk. They were all in tremendous health. You know, they were tall and they were hale and hearty, and their faces were developed properly. You know, they displayed all the signs of what Weston A. Price called perfect health. You know, not only were they physically healthy, they were also mentally healthy too. But then when he looked at, for instance, people in Scotland in the same kind of area who were eating an industrial diet of factory produced foodstuffs, then they were suffering all of the same problems that he observed in his patients back in Cleveland. So, you know, physical degeneration of the structure of the face, their stunting. They were shorter than their ancestors had been on their traditional diets, all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, this book is an amazing book. I think it's an absolute classic of nutritional science. I mean, it's one of the greatest books of nutritional science ever written. It's a kind of mixture of nutritional science and ethnography, anthropology. I mean, it's a tour de force. And I think if it had become mainstream, as it should have done in the 1930s and 40s, and influenced nutritional science instead of the studies and the theories that did influence nutritional science, then actually we'd all be much healthier for it if doctors were, giving information based on what Weston A. Price found instead of, the kind of nutritional and scientific advice that they did give. So I mean, I'm in absolutely no doubt that there is a long physical and mental and spiritual process that's been taking place. It's been going on for longer than 100 years, but I think, and this is my contention, that in particular the adoption of an industrial diet, of a novel industrial diet, which is totally unlike anything our ancestors ever ate before. And by that, I mean, in particular, a diet that is composed of what we call processed or ultra processed food. So that's food that is produced in factories, highly refined, contains large quantities of novel ingredients, vegetable and seed oils, refined sugars, emulsifiers, humectants, preservatives, antifungals, texturizers, all of these novel compounds. That diet in particular has hastened the degeneration of modern man in to a great degree. So I wouldn't I would be the first to say, look, I think that actually this process of physical, spiritual, mental degeneration has been taking place for a long time, because I do. And actually, as an aside, you can compare the skeletons of hunter-gatherers from, say, 10, 15,000 years ago to those of the earliest farmers. And you can see a process, the agricultural revolution took place about 10, 12,000 years ago in the Near East. You can actually see a process of physical degeneration taking place even then, 10, 15,000 years ago. And if you look back even further, there's good evidence that even, the hunter-gatherers of 10 or 15,000 years ago had less testosterone, were less robust on the basis of their skeletal evidence than and displayed less sexual dimorphism, i.e., difference between male and female, than hunter-gatherers from 40,000 years ago. So I think there's a long process of physical degeneration that's been taking place as man has become, quote unquote, more civilized, with the advent of agriculture in particular. But then we've got this modern period, let's say the last 300 years, but certainly the last 100 years, where things are really, really accelerating. And I think that a large part of it, as I say in my essays and books, is the modern diet, and also exposure to things like endocrine disrupting chemicals. These are these horrible, horrible toxic industrial chemicals that are associated in particular with the manufacture of plastics, but they're basically in more or less every single industrial consumer product you could think of. They're in perfume and deodorant, they're in face creams, they're in processed foods, they're everywhere. And we are awash in these chemicals that are interfering with the body's natural hormonal balance and also interfering with the body's metabolism with the thyroid gland, causing us to store more fat, altering our metabolic rate so we burn fewer calories, etc. So it's I mean that's a very long answer, and I've touched on a lot of different things. But yes, I mean I think it's indisputable that there is a process, a very, very harmful process of degeneration, devolution, whatever you want to call it, that is taking place, and it has implications for everything. And this is one of the reasons why when people say to me, um, oh, you write about health and fitness, about diet, etc. What's that got to do with anything? I'm like, it has to do with everything. You have to understand this has to do with everything. There is nothing about being human and about society that this does not touch.
Yes, I think some people said the revenge of the new world that was colonized by the old world, Indians being killed, the indigenous civilizations being wiped out. The revenge was refined sugar, right? Coming from the Antilles and the Caribbean to Europe and starting a certain process of poisoning and so on. I think your argument comes back to the old classical European saying that a healthy mind can only be located in a healthy body, right?
Yes.
So that was the old saying that was inscribed on a place that I was educated in the ancient time, a long time ago in Holland. It was called a gymnasium. So the gymnasium was the place where the ancient Greeks not only practiced education, but also physical training. Of course, the latter now being practically eliminated from the curriculum. But that means that originally there was this awareness in Europe that there was a link between physical well-being, training, and mental well-being, and from there onward, spiritual well-being, of course, as well. So this is a holistic approach that has been absent from our, let's say, our public sphere for a long time now. That has also been absent, I think, from the dissident right, that has tended to focus on either the physical or the mental.
Yeah.
The separation between the two being, of course, a very dangerous and very artificial thing. That being said, I do believe there are there's not just one set of circumstances to be coped with all people. So there are large differences. People that study physical anthropology, as I did a little bit on my own, as a preliminary to cultural anthropology, know that races and groups all over the world differ widely from each other in the way they process foods. For example, the metabolism of a Patagonian Indian was such that they could naked walk around in a subpolar climate, right? We're talking about till about 150 years ago. The metabolism of Inuit people being very Eskimos, being very different from that of people living on lower altitude. So these are some obvious differences. Many people, they tend to overlook the studies that were done in the 19th and early 20th century into the differences between human groups, not only races, but also groups within groups. Specializations occurring, right, depending on the bio niche, the ecological niche that people inhabited. So if you, for example, look at findings that were published by Russians in the 20s, they found that Indo-Europeans, so Russians, native Russians, had a digestive tract that was much longer than of Turkish inhabitants of the Soviet Union then.
Huh. I never knew that. That's
yeah,
crazy.
yes, actually, like up to I think it was three feet averagely the difference. So indicating an actual different adaptation to the food environment that we're living in.
Yeah.
Of course, many people around us, they are aware that alcohol and milk intolerance differences between nations can be very big. I mean,
yes.
In Japan, if you want to date, just a little bit alcohol will do wonders in that respect. And so these differences exist, partially we are aware of it. And it is an interesting question to link them to culture. So what is the link between the natural inclinations and predispositions of populations together with their cultural dispositions? So, for example, the pork abstention that's known in Semitic races. Semitic races, they forbid the consumption of pork and certain other foods. They're called haram, which actually means unclean. And of course, in Zoroastrianism, which is very close in its origins to let's say the ancient Indo-European
Yes.
religion, there is a similar censure. It is forbidden to eat insects and reptiles, and it's interesting for me to ask you this: do you think that, especially this last point, that it is possible that Indo-European people overall are less able to digest or handle the nutrients, or let's say the ingredients of, let's say, insects and reptiles? Could that be true?
I think, listen, I think so. This is a very, very interesting field of inquiry. And it's, first of all, let me say, like, it's obvious that there would be distinct population level differences in uh, with regard to nutrition and the ability to digest particular foods. So, I mean, Africans, sub-Saharan Africans, have been isolated from basically the rest of the world, or were isolated from the rest of the world for like 70,000 years. So, we would expect there to be particular evolutionary differences among among sub-Saharan Africans that might distinguish them from Northern Europeans or from Native Americans. I mean, it just stands to reason. Populations are isolated from one another, or have been isolated from one another, to a significant degree. They eat different things. It's likely that there would be genetic mutations would arise, adaptations would arise, and so an African, a European might not do well on an African diet, and an African might not do well on a European diet. And these new genetic studies are actually starting to substantiate this to quite a degree. So you talked about the Soviet stuff, about the finding out that actually Indo-European native Russians have a longer digestive tract than Turks. That's interesting. I mean, that's and yes, we can look at physiological adaptations, but now we have all of these high-powered sort of microscopically fine-grained analysis of genetics that are coming out as well, that are really starting to tell us some interesting stuff. So, there's a whole field of what's called ancient DNA studies. So now you can dig up a Stone Age skeleton, you can extract DNA, and you can look at the genome of that person in great detail, and the adaptations that they have. You can analyze the genes, and you can see that, oh, they have this gene that correlates with being able to metabolize carbohydrates better. Or you look at another population like people of Indo-European extraction. You look at the ancestral DNA, the DNA of an ancient Indo-European skeleton from the Pontic Caspian steppe from southern Russia, and you find, oh, look, they have a gene for lactase persistence. That's the persistence of the enzyme that allows the digestion of lactose, which is the primary sugar in milk. And that's something beyond childhood. So children have lactase. In most populations, children produce lactase, but then when they become adults, they stop producing it. Whereas the vast majority of Europeans, people of Indo-European descent, continue to produce lactase into adulthood because their ancestors on the Pontic Caspian steppe, or one group of ancestors who contributed significantly to the European gene pool, were among the first herders, the first pastoralists. They domesticated horses and sheep and cattle and goats, and they herded them around the steppe, and they milked them, and produced cheese, and they drank their milk raw, and they ate their meat, and eventually they, domesticated the horses and rode them as well. So there's absolutely there's significant evidence that is being substantiated to a much greater degree now by these genetic studies, that individual populations possess particular adaptations to their diets, to their what we might call their traditional or their historical diet, and so populations that have a long history of consuming grains, particularly in places like Anatolia, the Near East, parts of Europe, will have specific adaptations that allow them to deal with carbohydrates, and digest carbohydrates, that allow their bodies to process carbohydrates and the compounds found in grains, including some of the harmful compounds, in ways that, say, the inhabitants of a South Pacific island totally lack. So this is one of the reasons, for example, why people in Polynesia, people in the South Pacific, are among the fattest in the world now, because they don't have adaptations to allow them to cope with the consumption of carbohydrates, particularly grains, on a level, on a par with Europeans. So all of these populations now, these people in the South Pacific Islands, they've abandoned their traditional diets, and they're all eating Western style, unhealthy, sort of prototypically unhealthy junk food diets. They're eating a lot of processed carbohydrates, and their bodies can't deal with I mean, we can't really deal with the carbohydrates like that, but they're in an even worse position. And so they have a genetic predisposition to get fat eating carbohydrates in the way that we do. And so they're getting hugely fat. I mean, you talked a little bit as well about the origins of food taboos, and that's a very interesting subject. And I mean, I've read plenty about sort of cultural materialist theories of the origins of the food taboos in India, in the Indian caste system, the taboo on the consumption of beef, for example, and why that might have arisen from a sort of materialist standpoint. And I think a lot of these stories are just so stories, really. If you think long and hard enough, you can come up with a convincing story that makes sense, but there isn't actually any way to verify whether or not it's true. I mean, I've heard people say, for instance, about the Jewish taboo on consuming red meat and dairy, that possibly arose because the calcium, if you drink milk at the same time as eating red meat, for example, same time as eating a steak, the calcium in the milk prevents your body from taking up the iron in the steak. And what can happen actually is that if you consume lots of dairy and red meat, or even just lots of dairy, you can become anemic, i.e., you enter a state of iron deficiency, because your body is being blocked from absorbing iron from the food by the large quantities of calcium that you're consuming. So this is actually something, interestingly enough, that these new studies of I was talking about the ancient DNA. These new studies of Western steppe herders, the Yamnaya, the Proto-Indo-Europeans who lived on the Caspic-Pontian steppe, who were herders, pastoralists. A lot of them actually, they were in very good health, but you actually see really good health. They were tall and robust, etc. But actually, what you see also is a tendency towards anemia. There is evidence of anemia, especially I think among the women, because women menstruate and they lose blood, and so they lose iron regularly once a month. So there's a tendency towards anemia certainly among the women of these Western steppe herder populations, probably because they were drinking a lot of milk. So yeah, I mean, I fundamentally, just to sort of cap all of this off, then yes, there is absolutely credible evidence that populations differ in their ability to handle different kinds of food. I think that's uncontroversial, and it will become it will become, I mean, the thing is, of course, that as soon as you start talking about things like this, then people in the mainstream scream racism, right? Because they don't, because the implication, of course, is that, well, if populations can differ significantly enough at the genetic level that actually, it might be difficult for one group of people to eat a food that another group of people considers to be normal, a staple part of their diet, then there are other potential implications about genetics, about the genetic differences between populations that open up. And that's a huge can of worms that liberals absolutely do not want to consider. So again, food is political, and this is actually an issue that isn't just about whether or not you can drink milk. It's actually about fundamental differences between human populations and what that might actually mean on a political level as well as just a nutritional one.
I think you're completely right in what you said. That's there's a political dimension to food. So the feeding of a population, which is the task of an elite, can also mean a manipulation of that food supply. So in a certain sense, it might suit a certain agenda to make a population literally unhealthy or deny them certain things or to insert certain elements in it on purpose. Of course, food taboos and food legislations in religions also have to do a little bit to do with power structures. People might not appreciate that. They might take it as a God-given law, but it has implications on the let's say the social interaction. So, for example, a Zoroastrian will not be able to eat with anybody else in the room. The same is true for a religious Jew. So there's a social separation that is connected to the different food consumption patterns here. But except for this very obvious observation, I also think the political dimension that you touched upon in your book. So this book, the egg Benedict option, right? Benedict option, of course, is a famous meme. It is the option of surviving of a civilization in a monastic form, in a, let's say, in a protective environment. And the egg Benedict form option gives a very nice twist to this in a certain sense of giving people a survival mechanism, a certain group of people, a survival mechanism for the future. Europeans can choose another diet and detach themselves from the politically imposed food regimen of the West at the moment. But I also wonder about another issue that's, I think, at least tangibly related to this, and that's the issue of vegetarianism. So I'm a vegetarian myself, so this is an obvious question to somebody that proposes a diet like yours, who has been singing the songs of meat eating, let's say, who has pointed to the advantages of it, the paleo diet advantages, but also the way in which it can take away harmful effects from modern nutrition, shift people into a different health regimen. The question of vegetarianism, it has been with us for thousands and thousands of years. There's even evidence of prehistorical vegetarianism, if not socially imposed, then at least practically imposed by, let's say, the ecological niche in which certain groups found themselves. There are large differences, of course, in how vegetarianism has been distributed between groups and races due to climate and geography. I mean, you wouldn't be able to be a vegetarian if you are an Eskimo, an Inuit. That being said, in the European tradition, vegetarianism has been prevalent in the older forms, so what we still know as Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. It has also had a prominent role in monastic Christianity. It has also had a presence, a foothold in Zoroastrianism, especially there's a group called the Ilum Gesnum. They still exist among the Farsis there. So these are indicators that vegetarianism among Indo-European nations has been a long time practiced by certain groups. So It has been,
Yeah.
let's say, for example, a monastic group. It has been a self-imposed regimen in a certain sense. So you get in the Hinduism, you get this caste system in which certain castes have to be vegetarian, some of them very strict, some of them don't. And there has been in Europe, this old in European system has been lost, but it has survived in a certain sense in sects. So, for example, if you look at the medieval heresies of Catharism, it was also this way that the top echelon of these people, they were the Cathars, they were vegetarian, and we can find the same now again. So we can see that as Christianity split and divided and fell into, let's say, collapse, in a collapse state, certain sects started to split off and become vegetarian, like the Seventh-day Adventists. And of course, the people that now claim to be secular, between them, there are very many vegetarians as well, and even vegans. Without asking a sociological explanation to you, what do you think, what is your take on the prevalence of vegetarianism in contemporary European culture, except as that it is promoted for, let's say, globalist ends, to manipulate people into certain modes of production and certain modes of consumption? That's obvious, but it's also an intrinsic phenomenon. It's triggered by certain concerns among certain groups of people, apparently, right? I mean, it makes sense for people that are not supposed to progenerate, not to have children, for example, like monastics or let's say high caste Brahmans, not to eat meat. To other groups, perhaps it makes less sense. But the same people that tend to be vegetarian and vegan in Europe also tend to be the people that have less and less children. What are your observations on this phenomenon, more than vegetarianism in Europe?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's I mean, I would be the last person to deny that there is an ethical case for vegetarianism, especially looking at the contemporary world, at the absolute state of factory farming. I mean, I'm in my book, I say that factory farming is an abomination that cries out to the heavens for redress. I mean, I think that factory farming is a crime, is a crime against sentient, feeling creatures, our fellow creatures. You know, they may only be pigs and chickens, but they are living, feeling creatures, and they do not deserve to be herded into massive concentration camps and tortured and slaughtered in the manner that they are. So, I mean, I intimately, on a very deep level, understand the vegan and vegetarian criticism of modern industrial farming. But I mean, what you're talking about really, I think, is the way that, yeah, like you say, there is a kind of intrinsic pull towards vegetarianism for certain classes. And I mean, yes, I think that if you're talking about monks, for instance, then there can be no doubt that actually, if your aim is to the aim of your monastic order, or if you're just even a hermit, and what you want to do is you want to isolate yourself from the world, you want to reduce your, you know, say, like if you're a Buddhist monk, you know, what your aim to do ultimately is to extinguish the material world, is to extinguish yourself as a part of the material world, to extinguish your will and all of your conditioning, so that eventually you can achieve, you can break the cycle of samsara and achieve nirvana. And being on a very strict vegetarian diet is a good way to do that. And I talk about this at length because, you know, it's for a man and also for a woman, hormonally, a vegetarian diet will extinguish the hormonal basis of willing and desire and libido in particular. So a vegetarian diet, I mean, there have been all of these studies that have substantiated this. You know, a low-fat vegetarian diet as a man is one of the best ways that you can absolutely, you know, extinguish your testosterone, basically. So, you know, if you go on a low fat vegetarian diet, with no animal products, then you can reduce your testosterone by 25% in a matter of weeks. And that's a significant drop. That's a significant drop. That will have massive implications for the way that you feel as a person, as a man. You will feel much less like a man. And so it's not a wonder, for example, that the only people in traditional Eastern societies who consumed unfermented soy, as opposed to fermented soy, were monks. And why did they do that? If you ferment soy, you destroy or inactivate the estrogenic compounds that you find in soy. So soy is full of these things called phytoestrogens, isoflavones. And what they do is they mimic the effects of the female hormone estrogen in the human body. So if you consume fermented soy, those compounds don't have any effect. But if you eat unfermented soy, they do have an effect. And it's basically like an infusion of female hormone. And consuming unfermented soy in large quantities as a man can make you develop breasts. I mean, that actually happens. That actually happens. That's not a meme. Men consuming unfermented soy over a long enough period of time will crash their hormones and they'll put on weight and potentially they'll develop breast tissue, gynecomastia. So there is yeah, I mean, I can see that there is there's kind of an enduring logic to the consumption of, as you say, of vegetarian diets for particular social groups that have particular aims that involve a retreat from the world. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But there's this other, as you say, there's this sort of social control aspect of it too, about, vegetarian diets and plant-based diets and climate change and sort of global gay race communism and all that kind of stuff. But what's interesting actually, and one of the, that's an intimate part, that's a central part of my book, The Eggs Benedict Option, is, talking about plant-based diets and this new sort of global form of diet and dietary control as social control. But what's interesting is that actually you get someone like Plato in the Republic talking about this 2,300 years ago. So I open the Eggs Benedict option with a discussion of Plato's Republic, the second book of Plato's Republic, where Plato's Socrates is talking with his companions Glaucon and Adeimantus, and they start talking about the origins of society, basically. And they do this little thought experiment where they kind of come up with a kind of just so story about the emergence of society. People come together and they band together and they form a division of labor and they form a kind of primitive society. And Plato's Socrates starts to talk about how in a primitive society like that, you could ensure perfect harmony among everybody in society if you made sure that if you made sure that they didn't eat any meat, that they only ate a vegetarian diet. And so what you've actually got then 2,300 years ago is you've got one of the first social planners, because that is what Plato was, he's a philosopher, planning societies, talking about ideal societies. You've got a social planner at the very beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, talking about how actually vegetarianism can be a form of social control and why. I mean, Plato actually says or has Socrates say in this section of the Republic, if you consume a vegetarian diet, it basically extinguishes what the Greeks called thymos. And thymos is this kind of part of a person that makes them spirited, that makes them want to distinguish themselves, makes them want to acquire things and to be to be competitive and better than their neighbors, and spurs people on to achievement. Plato Socrates actually says, if people in a vegetarian society then were given meat, it would inflame their passions and they would become acquisitive and competitive, and then you'd have civil strife and you wouldn't be able to have a harmonious society anymore. So, it's been recognized for a very long time, thousands of years, that that there is clearly a relationship between dietetics and social control, and in particular between vegetarianism, between plant-based diets, and a kind of and domestication. Maybe that's the best way to put it, that you can actually domesticate people, that you can basically make them like herd animals by enforcing some kind of vegetarian diet. And it's not for nothing, final point, it's not for nothing that the Mongols, when they encountered, so the Mongols were pastoralists, right? They were like the Yamnaya, the Proto-Europeans. They lived on the steppe. They herded animals. Their diet consisted mainly of meat, milk products, and blood and things like that. Very few vegetables. It's not for nothing that the Mongols referred to the peasants in the sedentary settled agricultural societies that they conquered, using the very same terms that they used to refer to the animals, the herd animals that they would round up. You know, they actually used like the same terms that they used to refer to yaks and cattle and horses, to refer to these grain-eating peasants, because they actually literally saw them as herd animals, because they didn't eat a meat-based, an animal product-based diet. So there's a very, very long, complex, interesting history to be told and to be explored about the relationship between vegetarianism and political liberty, and meat eating and the consumption of animal products and liberty as well. And that's something that I explore at length in the Eggs Benedict option, and something that I've talked about in a number of my essays as well. And, you know, once again, it just, it's just for me to say, this isn't peripheral. You know, eating meat is not it's not just a personal choice. It's about more than personal choice. It is actually about political freedom as well, and always has been, actually.
In my book Alba Rosa, I called this the nirvana option. So the option that people have, a group has at a certain stage in the development, let's say a culture that becomes very highly developed, comes to the stage of civilization, a stage at which cognitive abilities can be used for more than just daily survival, in which ethical awareness becomes very highly stylized, but also decadent, degenerate in certain ways. So, at a point is reached in which a society becomes unsustainable cognitively. I call this the nirvana option. So that's the option, the point at which, let's say, the Cathars did that. Yes, that was that medieval sect in Europe. The perfecti, the people that were on top, that had reached the highest developmental level in their belief system, they totally abstained from any kind of animal product, and they ended their life by an endura. That means a fast with only water till death followed. And I think it is interesting to say that there are tendencies in our European civilization at the moment that point to a very similar psychological mechanism, let's say a psychohistorical mechanism, in which you see a big group of people maybe being manipulated partially, but also being motivated by a specific form of, let's say, degenerate ethics, actually extinguishing themselves and extinguishing as many people around them as possible. That's exactly what you're pointing to. So the political, social implications of a diet, and a diet that is inspired by a belief system that fits to a certain civilizational state. The only thing that I find certainly positive about, let's say, this new ecological awareness, because it's part of a so-called ecologism, is that there is a certain element in it of holistic approach. So you can see that in our movement, the dissident right, in people like Linkula, and peripheral, like people like Kaczynski, the awareness that European man has lost touch with reality, touch with nature, touch with his roots, touch with the land. So there used to be such a thing called the green right or the deep right. And these people that belong to that and who developed ideas there, they had this very holistic, but also ethical approach to a new kind of handling of reality, a new approach to our society, a reform approach that I find very useful and that I find also valuable in our movement. Your thoughts, finally, on the issue of ecologism, and of course, part of that being the drive to plant-based diets, the elimination of the choice to eat meat or not. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I think it's a complex issue, and what I basically say in the Eggs Benedict option is that I think that fundamentally this move towards plant-based diets is about corporate control of the food supply. So one of the despite the window dressing, despite the justification that it's to save the planet, and also that it's to feed 10 billion people. So the only way that we can save the planet from climate change and feed 10 billion people by 2050 is to transition to a new plant-based diet, global plant-based diet, the first of its kind, because there's never been a global diet before, that's been adopted by every single person on the planet. There's always been significant variation in diets from region to region. This is, that's window dressing really for the truth of this idea, this plant-based agenda, which is that actually it's about corporate control. And I mean, one of the dominant trend, I would say, in the history of food over the last of the food supply over the last 100 years has been corporate consolidation. So like when I was talking about Weston A. Price, then, end of the 19th century, dawn of the 20th, most people, even in the Western world, even in the most developed nations, were still consuming food that was locally produced, minimally processed. They were buying from local farms, local producers, and also producing food themselves. We forget the degree to which ordinary people used to produce food in their own gardens, something that still goes on in Russia, and that's something that I talk about in the Eggs Benedict option. Is this thing called Russian household farming, or household gardening rather, where ordinary people produce significant quantities of food on little plots, either in their actual garden or out in the countryside if they live in the cities. But what happened over the last, let's say, 120 years is that corporations have captured and consolidated their control of the food supply, and they've done it to an enormous extent. So the food supply in the US is basically controlled by a few corporations. Basically, there's a multitude of brands on the shelves, but actually, when you look behind the brands, you'll find just a few companies controlling everything. The food supply is massively consolidated in a way that's without parallel in history. The food supply has never been in the hands of 5 or 6 corporate players before, but it is now. But the thing is, these corporations are looking always to expand their control. This is just the immanent logic, I think, of capitalism and of corporate capitalism in particular. So I don't think that there's necessarily some kind of big conspiracy. This is just what these companies want to do. They want to, well, the technical term that they use is break new ownership envelopes. They want to break new ownership envelopes. And so what the plant-based agenda does is it allows them to do that. So you have to understand, like all of these alternative proteins, plant-based meat, cell-grown or lab-grown meat, aquaculture, genetically modified grains, high yield, new high yield forms of wheat, new high yield forms of soy, new high yield forms of corn. These are all things that can be patented. And I say this all the time. I use this sort of it's basically become a chestnut. You can't patent an egg, but you can patent a plant-based egg. So these plant-based egg alternatives that you see, like Just Egg, and I forget the names of the other ones, but there are various different. Wonder Eggs is another one. You know, all of these novel products, they're processed foods that are in the control of corporations, and what's more, they're patentable. The processes by which they're made can be patented. So all of these foods of the future that are being sort of held up as the future of food, and we're going to move away from eating steak to eating 3D printed steak, and we're going to move away from eating beef burgers to eating plant-based impossible burgers. All of these products are corporate control. They actually allow corporations to control the product from production to distribution. It's like 100% corporate capture of the process of manufacture of these products. And so, I mean, fundamentally, that is the way that I look at this process. I say, well, we're told this is for the good of the planet. This is for the good of the population, of the world population, which is rapidly expanding, etc. But to me, it just looks like a continuation of a process that has been going on for 100, 120 years, which is corporate capture of the food supply, um, corporate capture of not only the production but also distribution, shipping, everything about the food supply now is, or more or less everything about the food supply is in the hands of corporations. And I think if the plant-based agenda goes ahead, if we really do end up with a world where it's more or less illegal to eat meat, or it's prohibitively costly to eat meat, and all that's really available is these plant-based alternatives, and maybe we have carbon taxes and even rations, etc., then what we'll see is we'll see a food production system that is totally in the hands of corporations, even more than it is now. There won't be small producers. There won't be small farms producing raw milk that you can just go and buy. There won't be small farms producing organic grass-fed beef. There will just be mega corporations like Tyson, JBS, and all of these other mega food corporations producing novel forms of processed food as alternatives to the animal-based products that we have eaten for the longest period of time. So, I mean, yeah, you will hear the plant-based agenda. Of course, it will be justified in terms of climate change and feeding the global population, expanding global population. It will be about pollution and the environment, etc. But actually, at base, there is this. It's just to me, I think there's all the evidence suggests that this is just a continuation um, of this long-running corporate consolidation of the food supply. So that's why these big corporations, which, okay, they have a lot of money invested in meat and meat packing and whatever, but actually that doesn't matter, because they can transition. They're investing billions, and corporations like Tyson and JBS are investing billions and tens of billions of dollars in transitioning to alternative products. So what you'll actually find is that these companies are rebranding themselves as protein companies. So I think it was Tyson, or it might have been JBS. I think it's Tyson, has um, trademarked the like sort of corporate motto, the protein company. So Tyson is not what it was once. It was just it was involved in meat packing and dairy. Well, now it's a protein company. So it's not about particular foodstuffs anymore. They're transitioning to being purveyors of macronutrients, and protein in particular, because protein is seen as being the sort of the key macronutrient, the essential macronutrient that we all want, protein. Well, you're not going to get protein from meat. You're going to get protein from farmed insects and plant-based meat alternatives made with genetically modified soy. Um, so these big companies are rolling with this because they understand, as I say, that actually these new products offer them a degree of control over their products that they could only dream of with meat. I mean, you can totally, more or less, totally vertically integrate uh, uh, let's say like a beef business. You know, you can control the farms, you can control the meat packing plants, you can control distribution, but you can't go any further than that. There's nowhere else to go. You can't patent the beef, and well, actually, now you may very well end up being able to patent beef if cows are genetically modified, but that's another story. Um, so for my purposes, then I think that this is about corporate consolidation of the food supply with the connivance of government, of course, because as we know, then governments and corporations are very much in bed together. So, um, I mean, that might sound cynical, and some people would say, oh well, but um, traditional agriculture is bad for the environment. Traditional agriculture does produce more carbon emissions. It does. And actually, I mean, that's maybe something for another day, but there's all the evidence suggests that actually this new form of agriculture, this new vision of sort of global plant-based diets and the agriculture that would be necessary to allow people to eat a plant-based diet on a global scale, um, would actually be more harmful for the environment. So there was a study, for example, that was done recently about lab-grown meat. You know, this is meat that's actually grown basically in a bioreactor. Um, that it's actually maybe 25 times worse for the environment than traditional beef rearing. So I don't actually think that there is a suitable that there actually is an environmental case in any way for this sort of new plant-based agenda, and certainly not since it's largely reliant too on genetic modification. So, we will see genetic modification of crops rolled out on a scale hitherto unseen. Everything will be genetically modified, and I think that that's a disaster too. Certainly, well, I was about to say it's a disaster waiting to happen, but it's already had disastrous consequences. We've already seen genetic escape from hybrid crops into wild crops, and it's had effects on the soil microbiome and all sorts of other stuff as well. And to be honest with you, we don't actually know whether in the long term consumption of genetically modified food is safe. We just don't. Nobody's done feeding studies. We don't have the long term data for human consumption of these foods. But we're pressing ahead with this anyway because it offers the big corporations that control the food supply, as I say, even greater control and the potential for even greater profits. So, yeah, I mean, I think again, it's another long answer, but I think that yes, that we need to understand the bottom line uh, of the plant-based agenda and who it benefits, who stands to benefit the most. Because we don't stand to benefit from it in health terms, I can assure you. I mean, if you want to understand why it's bad, why plant-based diets are bad for you, then again, I would recommend reading my book, The Eggs Benedict Option, because I discuss at length why plant-based diets are suboptimal. And it's something also that Weston Price talks about in Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. He says, I've never encountered, in his extensive travels, he never encountered a single traditional group that displayed perfect health on a vegetarian diet. It was just something that he never found. Every single tribal group, traditional group that he encountered that was in perfect health was consuming animal products, and in particular building a diet based around what he calls nutrient dense animal foods. So things like offal, um, liver, organ meats, dairy, shellfish and seafood, animal fats like butter and lard, fatty cuts of meat, eggs. Um, so so yeah, I mean, I think that we have every reason to be doubtful about the plant-based agenda and every reason to doubt the motivations of those who are pushing it. I mean, there are eco zealots who believe every word and who, are totally sold on the plant-based agenda, but I don't think that they're not liable to be paying proper attention anyway. So, but anybody who does a bit of digging, who actually looks at who stands to benefit from all of this, then it's hard not to come away with the impression that actually this is just an intensification of the corporate takeover of the food supply that's been happening for 120 years, as I say.
Well, to use a word that fellow dissident John Waters uses for the globalist system, he calls it the combine. We have today exposed another one of these elements of the combine, namely the corporate globalist food industry. Its very negative influence on our societies, on people's health, down to the biological level. Your work is invaluable in the sense that it gives people tools, it informs them, allows them to make choices on the basis of real information. Your books expose not only the corporate power structures, but the very refined ways in which food can be used to manipulate people in all kinds of politically expedient ways. These warnings should be heeded. Another reminder that I think your books give is that the human state, the state of being a human on this earth, is based in very prosaic and very rather crude and rather sensitive connection with nature, that this human existence has to be respected, that to go back to our roots is probably the healthiest way for us as a society to, I'm talking about physically going back to our roots by eating correctly and by doing the things that our ancestors did, including, for example, moving on your two legs instead of on four wheels. These things, they are quite important, and there will be no Western civilization without a Western man to carry it in a healthy body. So these things are very clear. For my part, I'm quite optimistic as far as the places that I have visited lately, which are the Mediterranean countries, Italy, Greece, which are places where it will be very difficult to convince people to eat anything else than what they have been eating for the last thousands and hundreds of years. I mean, in Greece, McDonald's couldn't even open one restaurant, which is quite positive indication of the natural immunity of Greek people against all kinds of innovations, unhealthy innovations. That all being said, I wish to thank you for your contribution to Arctos once again. I give you the last word, and I thank you once again.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye.